She ironed his shirts every Sunday night, every single Sunday for 20 years. She laid them out on the bed, collar up, buttons straight, sleeves smooth the way he liked them. She made his coffee before he was even out of the shower. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, left on the counter in the blue mug he'd had since before they met. She knew which side of the bed he slept on, which drawer he kept his watch in, which television programs made him laugh, which ones made him restless, and which silences between them meant everything was fine, and which ones meant something had shifted and she needed to pay attention. She knew this man. She had spent 20 years learning every corner of him. She thought there was nothing left to find. She was wrong, because in that house, the house they had built their life inside of, the house where they had celebrated anniversaries and argued about nothing and made up again and grown older together, there was a room. A room with a lock. A room she had passed 10,000 times. A room she had never been inside. And the day that door finally opened, everything she thought she knew about the man she loved, every memory, every anniversary, every quiet Sunday morning, turned into something she did not have a name for yet. This is the story of Vivienne Marshall, and the room her husband Marcus kept locked for 20 years. And what was inside it. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something. This is not a story about a cheating husband. That word cheating is too small for what Marcus Dewayne Marshall did. Cheating implies a slip, a moment of weakness, a mistake somebody made and then carried with them in guilt. What Marcus did was not a mistake. It was architecture. It was a structure he designed, built, maintained, and lived inside of on both sides for over a decade. 2 houses, 2 women, 2 complete lives running parallel to each other, close enough to touch, and never once allowed to meet. And the extraordinary, gutting, breathtaking thing about this story is that both women thought they had the real marriage. Both women thought they were the one. And the locked room, that door at the end of the hallway that Vivienne walked past every single day, was where Marcus kept the evidence. The records, the receipts, the proof that he had built a world that should have been impossible to hold together, and had held it together anyway, for years, through sheer discipline and calculation and a coldness that the people who loved him would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. Tonight we are going to answer 3 questions. What was Marcus Marshall keeping behind that door? How long had it been going on, and how far did it reach? And when Vivienne finally found out, what did she decide to do about it? Stay with me, because none of the answers are simple, and not one of them is what you're expecting right now. Before we go any deeper into this story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Vivienne Rochelle Carter grew up in Richmond, Virginia, the third of 4 children raised by her mother, Dolores, and her father, James, in a brick row house on the east side of the city. Her father drove a city bus for 31 years. Her mother worked the front desk at a medical clinic and came home every evening smelling like antiseptic and peppermint candy. The house was small, but it was full of noise, full of cousins on weekends, full of a mother who cooked like feeding people was a form of prayer. Vivienne was the one who watched everything. Her older sister Renee was the loud one. Her brother Calvin was the funny one. Her younger sister Dana was the bold one. And Vivienne was the one who sat slightly apart from all of it and paid attention. She noticed things. She remembered things. She kept a journal from the age of 11. She was not the kind of woman who missed things. That matters. Remember that. Because when people later tried to explain what happened to Vivienne Marshall, the first thing they reached for was the assumption that she must have missed the signs. that she must not have been paying close enough attention, that if she had just looked a little harder or asked a few more questions, she would have seen what was happening right in front of her. Those people were wrong. And this story will show you exactly why they were wrong. Vivienne graduated from Virginia State University in 1992 with a degree in business administration. She was 22 years old, methodical, composed, and possessed of a clarity about what she wanted from her life that most people do not develop until they are much older. She wanted work that was stable and meaningful. She wanted a home that felt like the one she grew up in, not in size, but in spirit. She wanted a partner who was solid, not flashy, not performing, just solid. A person who was the same in private as they were in public. A person whose word meant something. Those were her standards. She had held them since she was a teenager, watching her parents' marriage and deciding, quietly, that she wanted exactly that kind of steadiness for herself one day. She found a job as an office administrator at a commercial real estate firm in downtown Richmond. She was good at it, immediately organized, precise, the kind of employee who made everyone around her more efficient just by proximity. She saved money. She bought a used car. She sent money home to her mother every month without being asked. She was, by every possible measure, a woman who had her feet planted firmly in the ground. And then she met Marcus Marshall at a colleague's birthday dinner in the spring of 1994, and the ground shifted. Marcus Dewayne Marshall was 30 years old when Vivienne first saw him across a restaurant table. He was tall, 6'2", with a quiet confidence that was different from the kind of confidence that announces itself. He didn't fill a room by being loud. He filled it by being still in a way that made you notice him. He was a civil engineer. He had grown up in Petersburg, Virginia, 45 minutes south of Richmond. His mother, Gloria, had raised him mostly alone after his father left when Marcus was 7. Gloria Marshall worked 2 jobs for most of Marcus's childhood and managed to convey to her son, without ever saying it directly, that she expected him to be exceptional. He was. He graduated from Hampton University with honors. He was hired directly out of school by an engineering firm that worked on infrastructure projects across the Mid-Atlantic region. He was precise, dependable, technically brilliant. He could look at a system, a road, a bridge, a drainage network, and immediately understand how all the parts connected, how everything depended on everything else, how you could build something that appeared solid and permanent and trustworthy if you just got the underlying structure right. That ability to understand systems, to design them, to maintain them, to keep them from falling apart would turn out to be the most important thing about Marcus Marshall, and not in the way anyone who loved him would have wanted it to be. Vivienne and Marcus dated for 2 years before he proposed. She has described those 2 years in terms that are simple and specific and ring completely true. He was attentive without being smothering, consistent without being boring, present in a way that made her feel chosen rather than convenient. He called when he said he would call. He showed up when he said he would show up. He asked about her family and remembered the answers. He met her father, James, and sat with him on the porch for 2 hours talking about baseball and city planning and what Richmond used to look like 20 years ago. James Carter was not an easy man to impress. He trusted very few people on short acquaintance. He trusted Marcus almost immediately. That should have been everything. And for a long time, it was. They married in September of 1996. The ceremony was at a Baptist church in Richmond's North Side neighborhood. There were 140 guests. Vivienne's mother cried from the moment she saw her daughter in her dress to the moment the reception ended 3 hours later. Vivienne's sister Renee gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then made half the room cry. Marcus's mother Gloria sat in the front row and kept her composure with the focused stillness of a woman who had learned, long ago, that emotion was something you managed carefully. Marcus's best man was his closest friend from college, a man named Terrence Good, who would later become one of the few people in this story who saw things clearly from the beginning and said nothing a silence he would spend years trying to understand about himself. The Marshalls bought a house in Chesterfield County, south of Richmond, in 1997. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a backyard with a maple tree that Vivienne immediately decided she loved. The neighborhood was quiet, stable, the kind of place where people waved from driveways and kept their yards tidy. Marcus had chosen the house. He had walked through 22 properties over 3 months before settling on this one. He had been particular about the layout. He had wanted, specifically, a house with a room that could serve as a private study space with a separate entrance from the main hallway, a solid door, and good insulation. Vivienne had not thought much about this at the time. Engineers were precise people. It made sense that he would want a dedicated workspace. It made sense that he would want it to be quiet and separate. It made sense. Everything about Marcus Marshall made sense. All the time, in the moment you were looking at it. That was the thing about him. He made sure of it. The locked room was established from the very first week they moved in. Marcus had a deadbolt installed. He did it himself, on a Saturday afternoon, while Vivienne was at her sister Renee's house across town. When she came home, the lock was there. He explained it simply. His work required confidential project files. There were liability concerns. He needed a space that was fully secure. He was reasonable about it. He was calm about it. He handed her a glass of iced tea and said, with the even certainty that was his natural register, that she would always have access to everything else in this house, every room, every account, every corner of his life, but that one space needed to stay his. And Vivienne, because she was a woman who believed in trust, and because Marcus had never once given her a reason not to trust him, said that was fine. She said it was fine, and she passed that door every day for 20 years. Their life in Chesterfield County was, by all external measurements, a good one. Marcus's career advanced steadily. He moved from project engineer to senior project manager at his firm, and then, in 2004, launched a small consulting practice that took on contracts across Virginia and North Carolina. The practice did well. Marcus was disciplined with money, or so it appeared. He and Vivienne maintained joint accounts for household expenses, vacations, and savings. Vivienne continued working in commercial real estate administration and eventually became office manager at a mid-sized firm in the Short Pump area. They were not wealthy in the way that attracts attention. They were comfortable in the way that allows a life to run smoothly. They took one vacation a year, sometimes two. They had a circle of friends they saw regularly. Couples from the neighborhood, people from Marcus's firm, a few close friends from Vivienne's college years. The couple that anchored the neighborhood for Vivienne was the Washingtons, Deshawn and Portia, who lived 4 houses down and became the kind of friends you call at midnight and who show up without being asked. Portia Washington would later describe the Marshalls' marriage as one of the most stable-seeming partnerships she had ever observed up close. Marcus and Vivienne made sense together, she told me. They were quiet. They fit. You never saw them performing for anybody. They just were. She paused for a long time. And that's the thing I keep coming back to. Because if it was a performance, and it was, on his side, then he never broke character. Not once. Not in front of me. Marcus traveled frequently for work. This was established early and remained consistent across the entire marriage. He was away 3 or 4 days most weeks, site visits, client meetings, project reviews in other cities. He would call in the evenings when he was away. He would text when he landed somewhere new. He was reliable in his contact, punctual in his returns, consistent in the story of where he had been and what he had been doing. Vivienne had married a man who traveled for work. She had accepted that as a condition of the life she had chosen. She had built her own life in the spaces his travel created, her friendships, her routines, her evenings with Portia Washington over a glass of wine and a television program they both loved. She was not a woman who sat waiting for her husband to come home. She was a woman who had a full life that he returned to. That distinction mattered, and it would matter even more when everything came apart. There were things Vivienne noticed over the years that she filed away without ever examining too closely. Small things. Not alarms, more like notes in the margin of a book you are reading too fast to fully process. Marcus sometimes confused details, referred to a conversation they had never had, mentioned a restaurant they had never been to, corrected himself so smoothly and naturally that the correction barely registered. There were phone calls he took in another room. Not all of them, most of his calls were taken openly, professionally, in the normal way. But some of them. Marcus was occasionally unreachable for several hours at a time when he was traveling, not unusual for a man on active job sites. But occasionally the window of silence was longer than felt quite right, and when he called again the explanation was always complete and plausible and somehow left Vivienne feeling that she had been worrying unnecessarily. She would feel slightly embarrassed for having wondered. That feeling, that small, engineered embarrassment at her own suspicion, was one of Marcus Marshall's most refined tools. He never made her feel foolish directly. He made her feel, very gently and consistently, that her instincts were slightly miscalibrated, that she was imagining things that were not quite there. He had been doing this, she would later realize, from almost the very beginning. And she had been so committed to trusting him, so certain that distrust was a failure of the relationship rather than a reasonable response to her own perceptions, that she had talked herself out of her own clarity every single time, that on a Wednesday morning in October of 2016, Marcus Marshall left the house in Chesterfield County earlier than usual. He had a site visit, he said, up near Fredericksburg. He would be back Thursday evening. He kissed Vivienne on the forehead. He picked up the travel bag he kept by the front door. He walked down the hallway past the locked room the way he always did, without looking at it, the way you don't look at something that is simply part of the structure of a house. He left. Vivienne heard the truck back out of the driveway. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee mug and watched his taillights disappear around the corner. She stood there for a moment longer than usual. She could not have told you why. She went to work. She came home at 6. She made dinner for one, which she had done hundreds of times and had long since stopped attaching any feeling to. She called her sister Renee. She watched an hour of television. She went to bed. At some point around 11 o'clock, she got up to get a glass of water. The hallway was dark. She walked down it toward the kitchen in the way you walk through your own house in the dark when you know every step without thinking, without looking. And then she stopped, because the door to the locked room was not fully closed. The deadbolt was not engaged. The door sat slightly open, a thin line of ambient light from the window inside pushing through the gap. Marcus, in his rush to leave early, had not pulled it completely shut behind him. The door that had been locked for 20 years was standing open, and Vivienne stood in the dark hallway in her bare feet and looked at it for a very long time. She has said, in the years since, that she almost didn't go in. She has said this clearly and without the shame that people sometimes try to attach to it afterward. She was not afraid of what she might find. She was not afraid of the room. She was afraid of herself, afraid of what it said about her that she wanted to go in. Because she had accepted the lock. She had agreed to the lock. She had repeated to herself, over 2 decades, that the lock was about privacy and professional necessity, and the simple truth that even the people you love most need a space that belongs only to them. She had built a philosophy around that door. And pushing it open meant admitting that the philosophy had always been, on some level, a story she told herself so that she wouldn't have to ask why a man who claimed to have nothing to hide kept one room in his house where his wife could never go. She turned and walked back toward the bedroom. She got 4 steps, and then she stopped again, and then she turned back. She has described what she felt in that moment not as curiosity that is too light a word for it, but as something closer to a reckoning, a quiet, bone-deep recognition that she had waited long enough. That whatever was behind that door, she was done letting the lock decide what she was allowed to know about her own life. She put her hand on the door. She pushed it open. She reached inside and turned on the light. The room was not what she expected. She had imagined. Over the years, in the rare moments she allowed herself to imagine, a simple office. A desk, some filing cabinets, project blueprints, the ordinary infrastructure of a man's professional life. And those things were there. The desk was large and neatly organized. There were filing cabinets against one wall, their drawers labeled in Marcus's precise handwriting. There was a drafting table in the corner with engineering drawings stacked and rolled. There was a bookshelf along the back wall, technical manuals, reference texts, 2 years' worth of industry journals. And for approximately 60 seconds, Vivienne Marshall stood in the doorway of her husband's locked study and thought, "It's exactly what he said it was. There is nothing here." And she felt something she recognized, with some mortification, as relief. And then she looked at the desk more carefully. On the right side of the desktop, half under a manila folder, was a photograph. It was a 5x7 print, the kind you get developed from a real camera rather than printed off a phone. It showed a woman Vivienne had never seen before, a woman in her early 40s, black, pretty, with natural hair and a wide, easy smile, standing in a backyard with 2 children. A boy of about 12 and a girl of about 9. The boy had his arm around the girl. The woman had her arm around the boy. They were all squinting slightly into afternoon sunlight. It was the kind of photograph you take on a regular Sunday. The kind that no one poses for. The kind that only exists because someone was happy enough in that moment to reach for a camera. Vivienne picked the photograph up. She turned it over. Written on the back, in handwriting she did not recognize, Marcus, me, and the babies. Thanksgiving 2013. She put the photograph down on the desk. She opened the manila folder. Inside were more photographs. A dozen, perhaps 15. The same woman. The same children. Different settings, different years. A birthday party with balloons. A Christmas tree. A school graduation. A cookout in someone's backyard. In every single photograph, the man standing beside the woman and the children was Marcus Marshall, her husband, wearing his face, wearing his smile, standing with another family in photographs spanning at least 8 years, and looking. This was the part that would stay with Vivienne Marshall for the rest of her life, looking completely, genuinely, entirely at home. She opened the top drawer of the filing cabinet labeled Personal. Inside were documents. Organized, tabbed, cross-referenced. A lease agreement for a property in Hampton, Virginia, over an hour away from Chesterfield County, bearing Marcus's name as the primary leaseholder. Utility bills. A car registration. Children's school enrollment forms. a pediatric dental insurance card, a birthday card from the boy hand-drawn, in a child's careful lettering. To Daddy, happy birthday, love Deshawn Jr. The boy's name was Deshawn, the same name as their neighbor Deshawn Washington. Vivienne stood with that birthday card in her hand in the locked room of her own house and understood, with a clarity that felt less like discovery and more like a door falling off its hinges, that her husband had a son, a 12-year-old son, named after someone he apparently knew from the life he lived with her. The woman in the photographs was named Tamara. Her last name was on a lease renewal agreement co-signed by Marcus Dewayne Marshall. Tamara Elaine Broussard. She was 41 years old. She lived in Hampton. She had 2 children with Marcus. And she had no idea, not a suspicion, not a hint, not a single crack in the story Marcus had built for her, that he had another family in Chesterfield County. Vivienne knew this before she even finished reading the documents. She knew it because she recognized the architecture. She recognized what a well-built structure looked like from the inside. She had been living in one for 20 years. She sat down in Marcus's desk chair. She did not cry. She has said this directly, and she wants it to be understood. She did not cry. Not then. Not in that room. She sat in her husband's chair, in her husband's locked room, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's other life, and she was extraordinarily, completely still. She told me that what she felt in that moment was not grief and not rage and not even shock. Exactly. It was something more fundamental. It was the sensation of subtraction, of looking at the last 20 years and watching them become something other than what she had believed they were. It wasn't like finding out something new, she said. It was like watching everything you already knew change its shape. All at once. All of it. Every memory. You don't lose the memories. You just lose the version of them you were living in. She sat in that chair for a long time. And then she picked up her phone. And she called her sister Renee. Renee Carter had always had her reservations about Marcus Marshall. She had never said so directly. She was not a woman who inserted her feelings about someone else's husband into that person's marriage. But she had had a feeling, a low, quiet, unverifiable feeling, that something in Marcus was held too carefully, that the composure was too complete, that there was a man behind the man he showed you. And the distance between those 2 men was something she had never been able to measure or name. When her phone rang at midnight and she heard Vivienne's voice, she knew before a single word was spoken that the thing she had never been able to name had finally announced itself. Vivienne did not say much on that call. She said, "Come. Please come now." And Renee said, "I'm already getting my keys." She drove 40 minutes in under 35. She found her sister sitting at the kitchen table, not in the locked room anymore. Vivienne had turned off the light and closed the door and walked away from it and sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of water she had not touched. Renee sat across from her. Vivienne slid the photograph across the table. The one from Thanksgiving 2013. The one with the woman and the children and her husband looking completely at home. Renee looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at her sister, and she said, "What do you need?" Not, "What happened?" Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "There has to be an explanation." She said, "What do you need?" And Vivienne, for the first time since she had walked into that room, took a breath. "I need to know everything," she said. "Before I do anything, I need to know all of it." In the days that followed, Vivienne Marshall did not confront her husband. She did not call a lawyer. She did not change the locks or pack his things or tell their friends. She went to work every morning. She came home. She cooked dinner on the nights Marcus was supposedly away on site visits, which is to say, most nights. When he returned on Thursday evening, as he had said he would, she greeted him the same way she always did. She asked about the Fredericksburg project. He answered. They ate together. She listened to every word he said and said nothing about what she knew. She has said that this was the hardest thing she has ever done in her life. Not the grief, not the legal proceedings that came later, not even the phone call she eventually made to Tamara Broussard. Sitting across the dinner table from her husband and giving him the face he had always seen, that was the hardest. I needed to understand the full thing, she told me. I needed to know the whole shape of it before I made a single move. Because if I confronted him before I knew everything, he would manage me. And I was not going to be managed again. She went back into the locked room the next time he was away. She photographed everything with her phone. The documents, the photographs, the filing cabinet tabs, the birthday cards, the school enrollment forms, the dental insurance card with Deshawn Jr.'s name on it. She sent everything to her own email. She organized it into folders. She labeled them carefully. She had been an office manager for 22 years. She knew how to build a file. 3 weeks after Vivienne first opened the locked room, she made 2 phone calls on the same afternoon. The first was to a private investigator named Jerome Aldrich, who operated out of Henrico County and had been recommended to her by a lawyer friend she had worked with at her firm. The second call was to that lawyer friend himself, a man named Reginald Okafor who practiced family law and who, when Vivienne laid out what she had found, was quiet for a long moment and then said, "Vivienne, I want you to hear me clearly. You did everything right. Now let me help you do the rest right too." Jerome Aldrich had been a private investigator for 19 years. He was former Richmond PD, 12 years on the force, the last 4 in fraud and financial crimes. He had seen double lives before. He had never seen one managed with the structural precision of Marcus Marshall's. What he built wasn't impulsive, Jerome told me. It wasn't somebody making it up as they went along. It was designed. He thought about every load-bearing point, every place the thing could fail, and he had reinforced all of them. Jerome would spend the next 6 weeks mapping Marcus Marshall's financial architecture, and what he found would change the nature of the case entirely. Marcus had maintained 2 separate streams of income for at least 12 years. His salaried position at the engineering firm deposited into the joint account he shared with Vivienne, the account she could see, the account that paid the mortgage in Chesterfield County and the vacation fund and the retirement contributions. But his consulting practice, the business he had launched in 2004, ran through a separate LLC with its own bank accounts, its own tax filings, its own financial life that Vivienne had never been granted access to or reason to question. The consulting income was substantial. Jerome's investigation, backed by forensic accounting work, estimated that Marcus had been running between $60,000 and $80,000 a year through the consulting LLC for over a decade. That money had funded the Hampton lease, the car payments, the children's private school tuition, the vacations and holidays and ordinary expenses of a second family living a comfortable life an hour away from the first one. He had kept the 2 financial worlds entirely separate. He had filed his taxes correctly. He had broken no obvious financial law, at least not initially. He had simply built 2 economies and sustained them both with the methodical care of a man who understood exactly how systems work and exactly where they break. Jerome flagged something early in the investigation that Vivienne had not found in the filing cabinet. A second cell phone account, registered under the LLC, billed to a P.O. box in Colonial Heights. The number had been active for 11 years. Jerome pulled the billing records, legally, through appropriate channels, with Reginald Okafor guiding the process. The call logs were extensive. Marcus called the Hampton number, Tamara Broussard's home number, every single evening between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, almost without exception, for 11 years. Every evening. The precision of it was staggering. He called Vivienne, as she had always known, at 6 o'clock when he was traveling. He called Tamara at 7:30. He had built a phone schedule and kept it with the same reliability he kept everything else. Jerome sat across from Vivienne at her kitchen table and showed her the billing records. She ran her finger down 11 years of 7:30 calls and did not say anything for a very long time. He never missed, she finally said. Not even close. Jerome nodded. The man had discipline, he said, with the grim respect of a professional recognizing another professional's work. Vivienne looked at him. He had practice, she said. The question of whether Marcus knew his secret was at risk was something Jerome turned his attention to next. And the answer documented in those filing cabinets in the locked room was more disturbing than either of them had expected. Among the files Vivienne had photographed was a binder she had initially overlooked, stored at the back of the bottom drawer beneath a set of older project blueprints. Inside the binder were handwritten notes Marcus's handwriting, precise and angular, organized chronologically across what appeared to be at least 8 years. They were not a journal in any conventional sense. They were operational records. Notes about what each woman had been told. Reminders to himself about which story applied to which life. Notes about close calls, moments where the two worlds had nearly overlapped, and how he had managed the gap. There was an entry dated March 2009 that read, V asked about Thanksgiving. Told her Hampton client dinner. Confirmed with T that kids' photos removed from wallet before Chesterfield trip. Adjust travel schedule November going forward. There was an entry from 2012. Team mentioned wanting to visit Richmond. Redirected to Virginia Beach. Confirmed V's work travel that week. Scheduled T trip accordingly. He had been running a project management system. On his own deception. On the two women who loved him. On his children. He had been taking notes. Reginald Okafor reviewed the binder and immediately understood its significance. The notes were not only evidence of the sustained deception, they were evidence of intent, of calculation, of a man who had not stumbled into a double life, but had built one deliberately, maintained it consciously, and documented his own maintenance of it with a thoroughness that was, in its way, more chilling than any single act of betrayal could have been. This isn't someone who got in too deep and didn't know how to get out, Reginald told Vivienne. This is someone who looked at what he was doing, understood exactly what it was, and chose to continue. Methodically, with notes. Vivienne sat with her hands flat on the table. I know, she said. I've known that since the first night. I just needed the paper to prove it. Jerome Aldridge's investigation eventually reached a point that neither he nor Vivienne had initially anticipated. The question of what Tamara Broussard knew. It was a question Vivienne had been avoiding. Not because she blamed Tamara, she was clear and emphatic about that from the beginning. She did not blame Tamara. She understood with certainty that Tamara was, by every available measure, as deceived as she herself had been. But the question of what to do about that knowledge, whether to contact Tamara, how to contact her, was one of the most morally difficult questions Vivienne had ever faced. I kept asking myself, she told me, what would I want? If I were her, if I were the one in Hampton who didn't know, what would I want the other woman to do? And the answer was always the same. I would want to know. I would want someone to tell me. No matter how it hurt. I would want the truth. She sat with that answer for another 2 weeks. And then she called Reginald and said she was ready. There was one thing she needed to do first, though, before the lawyers, before the investigators, before any official proceeding. She needed to go back into the locked room one more time. And this time, she needed to take the binder. What happened next is something Vivienne has described as the first moment, since she opened that door, that she felt completely in control of her own story. She went into the locked room on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus was in North Carolina, or so she believed, or so she still chose to believe for the purposes of maintaining the surface of things while she worked underneath it. She took the binder from the bottom drawer. She took the photograph, the Thanksgiving 2013 photograph, the one she had put back exactly where she found it after that first night. She took the second phone, which she had discovered on her second visit to the room, and she laid all of it out on the kitchen table. And she called her sister Renee. And Renee came. And Portia Washington came too, because Vivienne called her as well, because Portia had been her neighbor and her friend for 18 years, and because Vivienne believed, rightly, that the people who had witnessed your life deserved to be present when you started taking it back. The three women sat at the kitchen table of the Marshall home in Chesterfield County on a Tuesday afternoon in November of 2016 and went through every document, every photograph, every page of the operational binder. And when they were done, Portia, quiet, careful, always watching Portia, said, "He documented it. He actually documented it." Vivienne nodded. "He's an engineer," she said. "He documented everything." There was a long silence. And then Renee, who had always been the loud one, said exactly what all three of them were thinking. "He's done," she said. "He doesn't know it yet, but he is absolutely done." The decision about law enforcement came from Reginald Okafor, after a careful review of the financial evidence Jerome had assembled. The LLC structuring, the sustained income concealment from the marital estate, a property deed irregularity that Jerome had flagged in the Hampton records. These rose to the level of financial fraud. This was not solely a civil divorce matter. Reginald contacted a prosecutor's office contact and began the process of a formal referral. Vivienne agreed. She was not looking for revenge, she is clear about that, and it is important to be clear about it on her behalf. She was looking for a complete accounting. She wanted every part of what Marcus had built to be seen fully, in the light, by everyone who needed to see it. The locked room had kept its secrets for 20 years. She was going to make sure there was not a single document left in the dark. Meanwhile, Jerome Aldridge had made contact with a detective in the Hampton Police Department, not because any crime had occurred on Tamara Broussard's side of the situation, but because the financial irregularities connected to the Hampton property required coordination across jurisdictions. The detective who took the referral was a woman named Sergeant Denise Holloway, 14 years on the force, the last 6 in financial crimes. Sergeant Holloway reviewed the materials Jerome provided and spent approximately 4 hours in her office before calling him back. "Tell me you have the binder," she said. "Every page of it," Jerome told her. There was a pause. "Good," said Sergeant Holloway. "Because if you'd told me a man sat down and took notes on his own long-running fraud on 2 families, I wouldn't have believed you until I saw the handwriting." The question of Tamara was handled carefully, directly, and as compassionately as the circumstances allowed. Sergeant Holloway made the initial contact of visit to the Hampton address on a Wednesday morning in December of 2016, when the children were at school. She had done difficult notifications before. She had told parents about children and children about parents and spouses about spouses. She would later say that sitting across from Tamara Broussard in the living room of the house Marcus Marshall had paid for and partially furnished was one of the most difficult 40 minutes of her professional career. Not because Tamara fell apart, though she did, eventually, in stages, in the way a person falls apart when the information is so large that the body can only process it in pieces. But because of what Tamara said after Sergeant Holloway had explained the situation clearly and completely and asked if she had any questions. Tamara sat for a very long time looking at the photograph of Vivienne and Marcus that Sergeant Holloway had placed on the table, the Marshall's wedding photo, the one from the Baptist Church in Northside Richmond in September of 1996. And then she said, "He told me his wife died. Before we met, he told me he was a widower." She said it quietly, without drama, just the plain fact of it, surfacing from 11 years of believing it. Sergeant Holloway said she wrote it down without looking up from her notepad because she didn't trust her own face. He had told Tamara his wife was dead. Vivienne Marshall, ironing his shirts every Sunday night in Chesterfield County, keeping his blue coffee mug on the counter, building a life with him in the house with the locked room dead. In the story Marcus told the woman, he drove to every other weekend. He had erased her entirely. He had put her in the ground with a lie and built a second family on top of it. Marcus Marshall came home to Chesterfield County on a Friday evening in December of 2016. He came home to find Reginald Okafor seated at the kitchen table. Vivienne was seated across from him. Between them, laid out in the precise, organized way that Marcus himself had always arranged things, were the documents. The photographs, the binder, the billing records, the financial investigation summary that Jerome Aldridge had prepared. It was a complete file. It was the full record of the double life, assembled with the same careful methodology that Marcus had used to build it. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen for a long moment. He did not say anything. And Vivienne, who had spent weeks preparing for this moment, who had rehearsed and revised and reconsidered every possible way it might go, simply looked at her husband and said, "Sit down, Marcus. We're going to go through all of it." He sat down. He was, as he had always been in the most critical moments of his life, completely calm. He looked at the documents. He looked at the binder. He looked at the photograph from Thanksgiving 2013. And then he looked at Vivienne. And the expression on his face was something she has never been able to fully describe and has never stopped trying to. It wasn't guilt, she told me. It wasn't panic. It wasn't even shame exactly. It was something closer to calculation. Like he was sitting there looking at the board and figuring out which move he still had left. She was right. He did have one move left. And it was a move nobody had anticipated. Marcus Marshall did not deny the double life. He did not claim the documents were forged or that Jerome Aldridge had manufactured the evidence, or that there was an innocent explanation for 11 years of 7:30 phone calls to a woman in Hampton. He admitted it, directly, calmly, and in the specific, careful language of a man who had already, somewhere between the driveway and the kitchen table, decided on his defense strategy. He said that he had a condition, a psychiatric condition diagnosed, he claimed, privately, by a therapist he had been seeing for 15 years. A dissociative condition that caused him to compartmentalize in ways he could not fully control. That the second family was not a decision he had made, but a consequence of a fracture in his psychological structure that he had been managing, privately, and struggling with, for his entire adult life. He said it without tears. He said it the way a man presents findings at a project review. Organized, complete, calibrated for the audience in front of him. Reginald Okafor listened to the entire statement without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Reginald reached across the table and slid the binder toward him. He opened it to a page near the middle, the entry from March of 2009, the one about redirecting V's questions about Thanksgiving, about removing the children's photographs from the wallet before the Chesterfield visit, about adjusting the November travel schedule. He tapped the page once. He said, "Tell me about this entry. Tell me what kind of dissociative condition produces a travel schedule adjustment and a wallet audit." Marcus looked at the entry. He did not answer. Reginald closed the binder. "I thought so," he said. The psychiatric defense was not abandoned. Marcus's attorney, a man named Gerald Whitfield who practiced in Richmond and was known for navigating complex financial litigation, would refine and advance it through the early stages of the proceedings. But the binder was a problem that Gerald Whitfield could not solve, because the binder was not the product of a man who did not know what he was doing. The binder was a project management document. It used the same structural logic as Marcus's engineering work. It had timelines and contingencies and risk assessments written in the margin of entries where something had come close to going wrong. A forensic psychologist hired by the prosecution reviewed the binder and provided a written assessment that was direct and comprehensive. The level of sustained, conscious, self-aware management documented in these notes was inconsistent with any dissociative framework that would reduce the subject's legal culpability. The man who wrote these notes, the psychologist concluded, knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it every time he wrote an entry. He knew it every time he adjusted the travel schedule. He knew it every time he sat at that desk in the locked room and updated the record of the deception he was consciously maintaining. The psychiatric defense collapsed under the weight of Marcus Marshall's own thoroughness. He had documented himself into a corner, and no amount of composure, no amount of calm professional presentation was going to get him out of it. The charges were filed in the spring of 2017. Financial fraud, concealment of marital assets across a 12-year period. Forgery, a signature irregularity on the Hampton property deed that Jerome Aldridge had flagged early and that forensic document analysis confirmed. Fraudulent misrepresentation, the statement Marcus had made to Tamara Broussard, documented in a sworn affidavit she provided, that his wife had died before they met. That last charge was the one that drew the most attention, because it was the one that most clearly expressed the nature of what Marcus had done. He had not merely deceived two women. He had killed one of them in a story. He had told a woman he claimed to love that the other woman he actually loved was dead. He had used Vivienne's life, her living, breathing, ironing his shirts, making his coffee life as cover, and then he had erased it entirely in the telling. The fraudulent misrepresentation charge did not carry the heaviest sentencing, but it carried the most moral weight. And in the courtroom, when the prosecutor read it aloud, Vivienne Marshall sat in the gallery beside her sister Renee and did not look at Marcus. She looked straight ahead. She did not need to look at him. She had already seen everything she needed to see. The verdict came in September of 2017. Marcus Dewayne Marshall was convicted on all 3 counts. He was sentenced to 5 years, with the possibility of parole after 2. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke directly to the nature of the deception, not just its duration, but its architecture. She noted that the binder alone represented one of the most deliberately self-documented cases of sustained marital fraud she had encountered in 24 years on the bench. She noted that 2 families had been materially harmed. She noted that 2 children had grown up believing in a version of their father that was, in its essential structure, a managed fiction. She sentenced Marcus Marshall with the steady, clear language of someone who had read the binder and the billing records and the operational notes in the margin and understood exactly what she was looking at. Vivienne sat and listened to every word. When it was over, she did not celebrate. She stood in the hallway outside the courtroom with Renee and Jerome Aldridge and Reginald Okafor, and she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." As though something had been confirmed that she already knew but had needed the official record to reflect. There is a detail in this story that I have been holding back. Not because it is the most dramatic detail, though it is, in its own way, the most revealing. I have been holding it back because it does not fit cleanly into any of the categories we use for stories like this one. It is not evidence. It is not legal. It does not change the verdict or the sentence or the financial settlement. But it is, I think, the detail that tells you the most about who Marcus Marshall actually was. And it surfaces from the binder. From an entry dated February 2014. Marcus had written, "V mentioned wanting to travel to Italy for 20th anniversary. Begin planning. Research Hampton availability same dates. Coordinate both calendars." He had been planning both anniversary celebrations simultaneously. He had been reading Vivienne's dream, the Italy trip she had mentioned, the trip she had been thinking about for their 20th anniversary, 2 years away, and his immediate, documented, reflexive response was to figure out how to schedule the same anniversary dates with Tamara. He had been managing their dreams as logistics. Her hope for their 20th anniversary became, in the binder, a scheduling problem to solve across 2 households. Vivienne found that entry in the binder during the investigation. She found it on a night when Renee had gone home and Jerome Aldridge had gone home and Reginald Okafor had gone home, and she was alone in the kitchen with the documents spread across the table. She has said that this was the moment she finally cried. Not the locked room. Not the Thanksgiving photograph. Not the night she found out he had told Tamara she was dead. The Italy entry. The evidence that her privately held dream had been turned, without her knowledge, into a row on a spreadsheet. That was the moment. She sat at her kitchen table and cried for the first time since this had all begun. She cried for a long time. And when she stopped, she got up and washed her face and made herself a cup of tea and sat back down. And she kept going. Marcus Marshall served 26 months before being granted parole. He was released in late 2019. By all accounts, he had been a model prisoner, organized, cooperative, well-regarded by staff, the kind of man who knew how to present well in any institutional setting. Upon release, he made no contact with Vivienne. He made no contact with Tamara. He moved to a rental property in a city I am not going to name, and he rebuilt his professional life with the same methodical efficiency he had always applied to everything. His engineering license was reinstated. He is working again. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves to be sat with. A man who sustained a 12-year financial fraud against 2 families, who documented his own deception with project management precision, who told the mother of his children that his legal wife was dead. That man served 26 months and went back to the work that had funded all of it. The system saw what he had done. The system said what it said, and then the system moved on. It is worth asking whether that is justice or whether it is simply the law. Those 2 things are not always the same. Tamara Broussard received nothing from the legal proceedings in the way that the law typically provides remedy. She had not been legally married to Marcus. The Hampton property was tied up in proceedings related to the LLC fraud and was eventually sold, with the proceeds folded into the marital estate. Tamara and her children moved in with her mother in Newport News while the proceedings dragged on. The children, Deshaun Jr., who was 14 by the time the verdict came down, and his sister Amara, who was 11, were told the truth by Tamara in the most careful, loving, age-appropriate way she could manage. Deshaun Jr. chose, upon learning it, to have no contact with his father. He has maintained that position. Amara, after years of counseling and with the support of her mother and extended family, eventually re-established a supervised relationship with Marcus. Tamara has spoken about this with the specific, complicated grace of a woman who had to learn to love her children's right to make their own choices about a man who had hurt her beyond her ability to fully describe. Amara loves her father, Tamara told me. She loves a version of him that's real to her. I'm not going to take that from her. I just make sure she knows the whole truth first. Every part of it. And then I let her choose. She said this with the steadiness of someone who has paid for that steadiness at a cost most people will never have to understand. Vivienne Marshall sold the house in Chesterfield County 14 months after the verdict. She could not stay in it. Not because she was afraid of the memories. She is not a woman who runs from things, but because she had built that house as a structure of shared life. And she had learned that the sharing had always been incomplete, and a structure that is built on incomplete foundations cannot hold the weight you put on it no matter how solid it looks from the outside. She bought a smaller house closer to her sister Renee, in a neighborhood where she did not know everyone, but was beginning to. She went back to work. She went to therapy. She says this directly and without any embarrassment, because she believes in honesty the way she has always believed in it, completely and without reservation. She walked, and then she ran. Literally, she started running, which she had never done before, and she ran a 5K the spring after the verdict, and then a 10K the fall after that. She has said that running was the first thing she did in those years that was entirely hers, that no one had ever known about, that had no locked door and no binder entry and no management note in the margin, just her and the pavement and however far she decided to go that day. She went to Italy. The 20th anniversary had passed without ceremony and without the trip she had dreamed of. She went on her own, 2 years later, with Renee. She sent me a photograph from the trip. She is standing in front of a window in Florence looking out over rooftops, and she is smiling with the particular, specific quality of a woman who has gotten exactly where she meant to go. She kept the deadbolt, the one from the locked room door. It is in a drawer somewhere in her new house. She cannot entirely explain why she kept it. She has tried and offered several versions of the answer over the years. The version she keeps returning to is this: that lock wasn't the problem. I've had to be honest with myself about that. The problem was that I decided, 20 years ago, that trusting someone meant not asking questions. That real love meant taking the closed door at its word. And that was my mistake, not that I trusted him, but that I confused trusting him with silencing myself, with pretending I didn't have a voice that needed to ask. That deadbolt is there to remind me, not of him, not of what he did. It's there to remind me that I have the right to ask what is behind the door. Any door, in any room of any life I am living. And I'm never going to talk myself out of asking again. There is one more thing I need to tell you, and it is the thing that, in all of the time I spent with this story, I could not stop thinking about. In the binder near the very end, in an entry dated January of 2016, 9 months before Vivienne opened the door, Marcus had written a single line that stood apart from the operational notes around it. It was not a logistics note. It was not a scheduling reminder. It was not a risk assessment. It was just a line. 3 sentences. And it read, It is getting harder to keep the geometry right. I am tired in a way I cannot explain to either of them. I do not know how much longer I can do this." He was tired. After 22 years of building and maintaining and managing the two lives, Marcus Marshall was tired. He wrote it down, and he went on anyway, because he did not know how to stop, because he had built something so complete and so load-bearing on both sides that removing himself from either part of it felt, perhaps, more frightening than continuing. Because the locked room was not just where he kept the evidence. The locked room was where he kept the cost. And every time he went in there and pulled out the binder and added a new entry and adjusted the next month's schedule, he was paying it. He was paying it alone, in a room with a lock, in a house with a woman who trusted him, while another woman an hour away put his son to sleep and believed, completely, that she was the only family he had. He was tired, and he kept going. And the door didn't close all the way on a Wednesday morning in October of 2016. And 20 years of architecture came down all at once. I want to step back from the specific details of Vivienne Marshall's story for a moment and ask you to sit with the question that has been underneath this entire hour and a half. Because this story is not really about a locked door. It is not really about a man who ran two families, or kept a binder, or told one woman the other was dead. Those are the facts. But the question underneath the facts is the one that lingers. It is the question that Vivienne herself has been living with ever since she stood in that dark hallway in her bare feet and looked at a door that was finally, slightly, open. And the question is this: how much of what we call a marriage, what we call a relationship, what we call an intimate knowledge of another human being is built on the simple assumption that what we cannot see does not exist? We give people the benefit of the doubt because love asks us to, because suspicion feels like a betrayal of the relationship, because trusting someone, in our culture and in our upbringing, is framed as a virtue and questioning them is framed as a failing. And Marcus Marshall understood that. He built 20 years of safety inside that assumption. He understood that Vivienne's trust in him was not a weakness in her. It was a quality he had selected for. He had recognized, early, that she was the kind of person who honored her word and expected others to honor theirs. And he had built his deception on top of that honor and lived inside it comfortably for 2 decades. What do we do with that? What do we do with the knowledge that the qualities that make us good partners, the openness, the trust, the willingness to take a person at their word and not make them prove themselves every day, are also the qualities that make a certain kind of deception possible? I don't think the answer is suspicion. I don't think the answer is mistrust or surveillance or the kind of anxious checking that poisons a relationship from within. I think the answer is what Vivienne herself arrived at slowly, painfully, and on the other side of an enormous loss. The answer is to stay connected to your own voice. To remember that asking a question is not an accusation. That curiosity about the closed doors in your own life is not a sign that you don't trust. It is a sign that you are paying attention. And paying attention, staying present in your own life, refusing to be gently managed out of your own perceptions, is not a threat to love. It is the foundation of it. The real kind. The kind that doesn't need a lock. I want to hear from you. Not as a formality. I genuinely want to know. If you had been Vivienne, if you had passed that locked door every day for 20 years and been given an explanation that was reasonable and calm and delivered by someone you loved and trusted, would you have opened it? What would have made you open it? And what does this story say to you about the balance between trust and self-knowledge in your own life? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one in the first 24 hours after a video goes live. Your voice in this community matters. And before you go, if this story stayed with you, if it made you think about your own doors and your own locks and your own quiet moments of wondering, then I want to make sure you don't miss what's coming next on this channel. Because the next story we are telling involves a woman who was told, officially and finally, by law enforcement that her daughter's case was closed, ruled accidental, nothing more to investigate. She walked out of that police station with a manila folder and a grief and a certainty that they were wrong. They sent her home. They told her it was over. They underestimated her completely. 2 years later, she walked back in. And what she brought with her the second time changed everything, not just about her daughter's case, but about every other case in that department that had ever been closed too quickly. If you want to be there when that story drops, subscribe now. Right now. Because stories like these, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the worst moments of their lives, this is exactly why this channel exists. I will see you in the next one.